controversial take incoming. I had to redo this speech like 3 times because I was getting lost in my own prep. So, couple of reminders before I start my speech. Firstly, this is not my own personal opinion. I love Lilia. I adore Somia and Book 7 in its entirety. I don't think I would personally want a world where Lilia died, but that is what I'm going to be doing in this motion. And I think that's genuinely like one of the things I love about debating is that debating forces you to talk about discussions that might be considered almost taboo if you even think about it, or like, yeah, they would be considered controversial opinions if you said it to a normal person. So, yeah, and third thing or second thing, I forgot my signposting. I guess third thing is that this is practice. So, but though if there are like things, thoughts, comments that you have in mind when it comes to this topic, totally appreciate them. So feel free. But without further ado, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. This is not about game marketing, whether or not that just because the fact that Lilia has like 6, 7 cards already released and he has like so many fans, like that makes a world like where like Twisted Wonderland devs like making Lilia die um completely unattainable, right? It's not something that's realistic. And secondly, this debate is not whether or not Lilia personally himself as a character wants or doesn't want to die. I think that's highly straying into the headcanoning point, and that would take too much time, right? I think rather what I'm going to be discussing in my speech is two things. Firstly, is there going to be dignity in the process where which side really gives Lilia more dignity? And secondly, is which outcomes are much more preferable? Is it the one where Lilia died and there were so many of these good impacts or bad impacts perchance? Or is it a world where Lilia didn't die and there were all of these outcomes? I'll try to discuss those right in my speech. On the first constructive, about the dignity of Lilia's choice, let's narrow down this debate and frame exactly what I'm talking about. Because where exactly does this life threatening situation even happen in the first place? This happens in the Book 7 epilogue. And I think important thing to note about Book 7 is that this is Malleus's overplot. It deals with a lot of themes, but the core message when it comes to Malleus, especially dysomia, is the themes of loss, the fact that you highly cannot prevent loss and you shouldn't prevent it, because what happens in Malleus Overblood, he tries to, manifest the best versions of people and keep them immortal through his own magic, but that it's like upped in the most extreme way. And so yeah, like end message essentially is that loss is something that can happen, grief is something that can happen, and so you might as well just enjoy like the present moment. And I think this is important because what happens in the Book 7 epilogue is this: Malleus is overplotting, Silver fights him, Malleus sends like an attack to Silver, and Lilia steps in front of Silver to protect him, crumbles on the floor and dies, right? In the status quo, the way that happened, the way that Lilia is saved is through the um through Malleus and Silver's magic literally combining together and like healing him out of that state. And while we're not debating on whether that choice that they made was a bad thing, right? We're debating on whether or not I'm going to be talking about why exactly that choice led to Lilia not being respected. Because I think it's important to note that this was his own choice when he stepped in front of Silver to actually like protect him. Because even if opposition makes a metric of dignity where uh him getting a second chance at life, him getting saved by his son, getting saved by Malleus, this is him being able to have more chances to take action, especially when it was portrayed in a former Book 7 arcs where like he has been like committed injustice against the Senate. Firstly, I think this is actually worse because this means that this isn't necessarily dignity, and it's probably outside of the scope of the debate, because firstly, that injustice that happened to Lilia back in the war times, or even after the war times, that should have been dealt by the draconias. Note that Malleus literally did not know that Lilia was being discriminated by the Senate until centuries later, until his overblood. And secondly, I would argue that the decision he made by stepping in front of Silver during his attack was actually the most proximate decision to him at the moment. Literally, like he just took a step, he died. And I would argue then that this would respect him the most because this is the most proximate to him. And compare on the comparative where like him taking action against the Senate, it probably has to do with a lot of bureaucratic processes where he has like condemn him in court, or in the worst case Malleus just orders the the arrest of these Senate officials. Even then, they probably have to hash it out in court. That's already something that's completely speculative, right? And the fact that I even have to think of a worst case alternative implies that there's all that's already heading into headcanon. The impact is not assured compared to like just literally respecting the fact that he chose to die at the moment. Ooh, cursed. Okay, second constructive then. What are the outcomes after Lilia's death? Let's frame the status quo canon outcome. Dysomia is redeemed somewhat where like they get to have therapy together in government mandated facility, and after that Lilia comes back for book 8 and eventually for fourth year internships and for the competition against RSA. Now there's two things that happen here. Is that firstly this gives you a message, right, that you are going to be happy when you communicate with somebody. But I would now, but let's try to talk about why that's a problem. And secondly, is that the consequences of actions for Malleus, like because what happens at the end of book 7 is that Malleus um loses a part of his horn, and he has to deal with his magic getting sapped away as a part of that loss of horns. But I think firstly, the problem with these two outcomes is that the message of book 7 is particularly one about grief. It's about loss. It's about the fact that you should be you should be able to cope after that because it's something that's out of your control. And when you apply it within the context of Malleus, the consequence of losing his horns and his magic is something that's completely separate from the concept of grief and loss. um because firstly, um the story, like it's very implied in Twisted Wonderland that magic is something valuable for Malleus, but like Malleus acts somewhat nonchalant the fact that he lost his magic, right? And so that means that he's not really that bothered about it. But the concept of losing people is something that is something that bothers him. This is an insecurity for him. And when we take into context that Lilia is somebody that's important to him and somebody that's central to that loss of people, I would argue then that when if it's a world where Lilia actually died, I would say that the value of grief actually gets much more like higher on our side of the world, and he actually gets to learn his lesson much more as a consequence of his action in the first place. So I think the comparative is simple. Is that on our side it does intensify the image. It doesn't really like go against what book 7 is trying to even teach or even try to portray in the first place. While on the opposition comparative is that it's simply foreshadowing. It's simply foreshadowing that Lily is eventually going to leave. It's just foreshadowing that they're still coping through these types of things. And I would argue then that these types of foreshadowing just tempers the implication of loss even further. And I would just rather see a world where that just like because in reality, grief does not work like that. It's not necessarily a slow word. Sometimes grief can completely take you by surprise, and this would have been one of the best moments for Twisted Wonderland to portray that when it comes to a relationship like this. So, for all of those reasons, propose.